Galactic Council enraged. Humans have over 500,000 dreadnoughts? The Galactic Council called a census. They should not have done that. I had been standing in the back of Chamber 7 for 3 hours, when Cytherix, the Council's head data processor, a six-limbed creature that moved like a question mark, had learned to walk, finally reached the human file. I was on my 4th cup of synth coffee by then. The first 3 had gone cold while I was pretending to review diplomatic notes on my datapad. I was not reviewing diplomatic notes. I was watching the door. I was watching the clock. I was watching Cytherix's 6 fingers as they moved through the census data, the way you watch someone's hand when they are about to pick up something they do not yet know is hot. My name is Voss Terran, Commander Adjutant, Earth Diplomatic Corps, 22 years of service, split between warships and conference rooms. I had been embedded with the Galactic Council for 4 years, long enough to understand how they thought, long enough to know exactly what was about to happen in this room. The Galactic Transparency Summit had been running for 2 days. Every spacefaring species in the Council submitted their fleet inventory for the record. It was a gesture of trust, they said. A show of goodwill, they said. A way to build lasting peace through open disclosure, said the Valorian ambassador Queelith, who wore the phrase like a garment she had purchased but never actually needed. It was also, quietly, a measuring contest. The Thurvians had gone first. 847 warships, including 212 battle-class cruisers. The chamber applauded. The Thurvians bowed their wide gray heads with the practiced modesty of people who had prepared their humble expressions 3 days in advance. The Keth Dominion submitted next. 2,200 vessels, a number that produced what I can only describe as impressed chittering from the species that communicated through throat vibrations. The Keth representative, an old scarred creature who sat like a monument, did not bow. He simply folded his hands and looked at the floor the way veterans do when people applaud the count of their weapons. Then came the sovereign clusters of Miran, 14,000 ships. The chamber actually went quiet for a moment before the applause began. Someone from the Felorian delegation called them a superpower, loudly and without irony. The Miran first voice, a creature that resembled a thunderstorm that had learned to wear robes, straightened up by 3 full inches, and looked around the room as though memorizing the faces of the lesser. I drank my coffee. The smaller species followed. The Doran Collective, 3,000. The Yeth Assembly, 900. The Preth, who had only achieved deep space travel 40 years ago, submitted a fleet of 61 ships, with such visible pride that several ambassadors applauded for longer than the number warranted, the way adults clap for a child's drawing. Then Cytherix reached the human file. He stopped. Not a pause. A stop. The kind that has texture to it. His 6 fingers hovered above the data terminal. His secondary eyes, the smaller pair near his temples, blinked twice in a way I had learned meant that his primary brain was refusing to ratify what his visual cortex was reporting. This figure, Cytherix said, very carefully, appears to be corrupted. I set down my coffee cup. It is not, I said. Every head in the chamber turned. Most of them had forgotten I was there. That happened a lot. I was the only human in the room, and humans, in the broader galactic context, were considered a minor footnote, a young species. Single system, biologically unremarkable. We had been council members for 60 years, which, in a body whose oldest members measured their civilizational history in hundreds of thousands of years, made us roughly equivalent to a new intern who had not yet learned where the restrooms were. Queelith, seated at the Valorian block, fixed me with the look she reserved for moments when I said something she considered presumptuous. She had many looks like that. She had practiced them. "Commander Terran," she said, "surely there has been an error in the filing." "There has not been an error in the filing," I said. Cytherix looked at me, then at the screen, then at me again. His mouth parts moved, without producing sound, which I had also learned meant that his secondary brain was now also refusing to ratify what his primary brain had decided. "It says," Cytherix said, slowly, the way a person reads something aloud when they are hoping the act of hearing it will make it make sense, 512,941 Dreadnought-class vessels, plus support fleets. He stopped. The chamber stopped. 47 alien species in that room. Diplomats, Adjutants, analysts, translators, ceremonial guards who were not expecting to earn their salary today. Every one of them had gone completely still. I watched the numbers sit on the holographic display above Cytherix's station. It floated there, blue-white, patient, in the elegant numeral system the Council used for official data, and it was large enough that several of the smaller scripts running beneath it had expanded their font size automatically, the way a screen does when the number is too big to look casual. "That is the correct figure," I said. The silence lasted 4 more seconds. Then everyone in the room tried to speak at the same time. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold again. I drank it anyway. The Miran first voice was on her feet. Her robes moved like they were also upset. She was pointing at the display and speaking in rapid Miran, which even after 4 years I could only follow at about 60%, but 60% was enough. She was saying, impossible. She was saying fraud. She was saying that no single system species with 60 years of council membership could have, without detection, without intelligence reports, without so much as a supply chain anomaly appearing in the trade data, constructed a fleet that dwarfed the combined military capacity of every species in the room by a factor that her translation implant was apparently rounding to the nearest integer because the full decimal was uncomfortable. The Thurvian block was talking to each other in low tones with the specific body language of people recalculating something they had felt safe about until 11 seconds ago. Quelith had not moved. She was watching me, the way you watch a card player whose hand you had already decided you understood. The Keth representative, the old scarred one, was not speaking. He was looking at the display, just looking. His hands were still folded. His face was the same as it had been all morning, but something behind his eyes had shifted, and I noticed it because I had spent 22 years learning to read the things that happen in the spaces between expressions. "I am calling an immediate recess," Cytherix announced, because someone had to, and his mandate included procedural control in moments of data irregularity, and 512,000 dreadnoughts qualified as a data irregularity. The chamber erupted into movement. I walked to the refreshment station on the far wall, filled a new cup, and held my hands around it until I could feel the heat. Somewhere behind me, 14 diplomatic delegations were having what I suspected were the loudest internal conversations of their political careers. Someone knocked over a chair. I did not turn around. The coffee was hot. First hot cup I had managed all day. I thought about calling Earth Command. Then I thought about what I would say. Then I thought about what they would say back. Then I decided the conversation could wait until I had finished the coffee. Some things deserve a moment of peace before the noise begins again. Through the tall observation window at the end of the chamber, the stars outside the station were exactly where they had always been. Patient, unhurried, not particularly interested in what any of us decided to do next. "Huh," I said, to nobody. The recess was called for 2 hours. It ran for 6. The emergency session began at what the station's clock called morning, though morning on a deep space political installation was a concept the architects had committed to with more optimism than logic. The lighting shifted warmer. The ventilation added something that was supposed to smell like fresh air and mostly succeeded. 14 delegations filed in looking like they had not slept, which, given that most of them had spent the night sending coded transmissions to their home governments, was accurate. I had slept 4 hours. I had learned in the military that sleep was a resource like ammunition, and you did not waste it on nights when you were not being shot at. Ambassador Quelith took her seat at the head of the inquiry panel. She had changed into formal robes, which meant this session was being recorded for the official council archive. She had also done whatever Valorians did to their face membranes when they wanted to project authority, and the result was an expression so controlled it had stopped resembling an emotion and started resembling a policy. "Commander Terran," she said, "the Council has called this session to seek clarification regarding the figures submitted by the human government in the Transparency Summit census. We wish to understand how this number is possible." I had been asked this question 6 times already. Twice by Quelith directly, once by her deputy, twice by the Miran first voice, through a closed-channel diplomatic request that I had technically not been required to answer, and once, very quietly, by Cytherix himself, who had pulled me aside during the recess, with all the subtlety of someone who could not stop touching a bruise. "I am happy to explain," I said. I sat down at the single chair placed before the panel. It was a smaller chair than the panel's chairs. This was intentional. I noted it, and did not mention it. The Council's assessment of human military capacity has, from the beginning, been based on an incomplete variable, I said. Every analyst your governments employed looked at humanity's census data and saw a single planet species with one inhabited star system, a recorded history of approximately 6,000 years, and 60 years of Council membership. They ran their models from that starting point. Which is the standard methodology, Queelith said. Which is the methodology designed for species like yourselves, I said. Species that expanded gradually, that built one shipyard, then another, then a third, across centuries. Species for whom the rate of production was a slow and measured thing. I let that sit for a moment. The Mirren first voice leaned forward. You are saying your production rate is different. I am saying that humanity, when it decides to build something, does not build it the way you build things. Explain. I looked at the panel. 14 faces, 14 species, 14 sets of eyes that had spent the last 12 hours running calculations that kept producing answers they did not like. 17 systems, I said. Silence. Humanity has not colonized 17 systems, Queelith said. Your official territorial filings show 1 inhabited world and 2 research outposts. Colonized, I said. No, we have not colonized 17 systems. We have industrialized them. The word landed differently than colonized. I watched it land. Queelith's expression did not change, but something behind it did, and I had gotten good at reading the thing behind Queelith's expressions. It was the part that was still thinking. The distinction, I continued, is that colonization means you send people, you build homes, you grow food, you establish governments and schools and all the things that make a place worth living in. Industrialization means something else. It means you look at every asteroid belt, every iron-rich dead moon, every gas giant with workable resources in its orbital path, and you convert it. Not slowly, not carefully, completely. I pulled up the first display. A star map, 7 systems highlighted in blue. These are the systems we began converting in 2031, when Council membership was still 3 years away. When nobody was watching the supply manifests closely because humanity was considered too small and too new to be worth watching. I pulled up the second display, 10 more systems. These followed between 2089 and 2200. The rate accelerated after 2089, for reasons I will address separately. The Mirren first voice was staring at the map. Her robes had gone still. She said very quietly, Earth itself. Earth hasn't been a shipyard for 400 years, I said. Too small. Too important for other things. You do not build dreadnoughts where children play. We moved production off Earth the same way you eventually move a factory out of a city center. The city center is for living in. The factory goes somewhere with more space and less noise. The Keth representative, whose name was Varen, spoke for the first time since the session began. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had long ago stopped needing volume to be heard. Your trading partners, he said. The raw material shipments. They were logged. They were logged as industrial development, I said, because that is what they were. The filings were accurate. Nobody asked what we were developing. Queelith's hands were very still on the table. You are telling us that every piece of documentation was filed correctly, that there was no concealment. There was no concealment, I said. There was an assumption on your part that we did not correct. Those are different things. She touched her ceremonial collar, a gold-threaded thing that sat at the base of her throat. She touched it the way you touch something familiar, when the unfamiliar is pressing in. 500,000 dreadnoughts, she said, plus support fleets. Commander, that figure represents a military force that exceeds the total combined arms of every species in this council, by a margin I am not comfortable stating aloud in a recorded session. I know, I said. You know, she repeated. Not a question. Something else. Queelith, I said, and I used her name without her title, which was a small choice, but a deliberate one. You want to ask me why, not how. I can see you working up to it. The how is a logistics question, and your analysts will reconstruct it within the week. But the why is the question that kept you awake last night. She looked at me for a long moment. Why? She said. I had prepared an answer. A careful, diplomatic, precisely worded answer that I had drafted at 2 in the morning and reviewed 3 times. An answer that addressed security concerns, historical context, defensive posture, and the broad humanitarian goals of human foreign policy. I set it aside. Ask me what happened in 2089, I said. The room went very quiet. I watched the faces. Queelith, the Miran first voice, the Thurvian block, Setherix, who was not technically on the panel, but had found a reason to be present anyway, and Varen, the Keth representative, who had not changed his expression, but whose eyes had, very slightly, sharpened. They had all read the file. The 2089 file was not classified. It never had been. Humanity had never hidden what happened in 2089. We had simply never announced it in a room like this, and nobody had ever thought to ask, because humanity was a footnote, a minor species, new to the Council, biologically unremarkable. Nobody asked. The silence stretched. Queelith's hand was still at her collar. The session will recess, she said finally, for 1 hour. I stood, pushed in my chair, walked to the window at the far end of the corridor outside the chamber, where the stars sat in their usual patient arrangement, and I looked at them for a while. Varen fell into step beside me. I had not heard him leave his seat or cross the chamber. He moved very quietly for something his size. We stood at the window together without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "How many of your people have died in wars?" Not the diplomatic question, not the political question, the one underneath. I told him the number. Not the official figure from the council briefing documents, the real one, cumulative, every conflict, every year, the full count, including 2089. Varen was quiet for a long time. Outside, the stars did not move. "We have a word," he said, finally, in his own language, not the translation, the original. I did not ask what it meant. I had heard Keth veterans use it once before, on a station near the border of their territory, spoken about a species that had fought them to a standstill 300 years ago, a species that no longer existed but was still spoken of in a particular way. I knew what the word meant. I looked at the stars and did not say anything. Varen went back inside. I finished looking at the stars, and then I went back inside too. 17 independent analysts, 17 different answers, all of them too high to feel comfortable, and not one of them high enough to be accurate. The council hired them on the second night, after the first emergency session adjourned without a resolution, and the political pressure from 14 home governments reached the kind of temperature where someone has to be seen doing something. The analysts were pulled from the best institutions in the galaxy, the Valorian Institute of Strategic Modeling, the Keth Military Academy's External Advisory Board, the Miran Cluster's own intelligence division, which had a reputation for accuracy that its members referenced constantly and its adversaries referenced cautiously. I read their preliminary reports over breakfast, cold synth eggs and a data tablet, which is how most of my important mornings seemed to go. They disagreed on the precise number. They disagreed on the construction timeline. They disagreed, in one memorable case, on whether the figure was a fleet count or a cumulative production total that included decommissioned vessels, a distinction that the analyst in question had decided mattered, and that I decided to let him have, because the argument would take 3 days and not change anything real. What none of them disagreed on was the implication. I set down the data tablet and finished my eggs. The political situation had fractured overnight, in the way that political situations fracture when a piece of information is too large for any one faction to carry. The Council's 14 represented species had sorted themselves into 3 rough categories by the time the second full session opened. There were the ones who were afraid, and expressing it as anger. There were the ones who were afraid, and expressing it as process. And there was Varen, who was afraid in a different way than the others, and expressing it as silence, which I had come to understand was the Keth version of listening very hard. The Miran first voice, whose name was Sereth, led the anger faction. She was good at it. She had a gift for reframing fear as principle, which is the specific skill that makes someone dangerous in a political body. She opened the second session by proposing that the Council formally classify humanity as a Class Omega strategic concern, a designation that had never been applied to a council member species in the body's history, and that, in practical terms, would initiate a coordinated military review of all human operations and access across council space. She had 16 signatures already, more than enough to put it to a formal vote. I sat at my assigned observer's chair, which was still smaller than everyone else's chairs, and I listened to her speak. She was good. I will give her that. She wove the facts neatly. A species that had, without declaration, constructed a military force exceeding the combined arms of the entire galactic community. A species that had never disclosed this capacity in 60 years of membership. A species that operated 17 undeclared industrial systems in what amounted to sovereign galactic territory without filing the appropriate expansion notifications. Every sentence was accurate. That is what made it effective. She concluded by putting the threat assessment calculation on the main display, the one that all 16 signatures had seen and agreed on. If humanity's military capacity was turned against the Council, the combined response fleet of all 14 species would sustain casualties in the range of 93% before achieving measurable resistance. The chamber was very quiet. "I want to be certain I understand the calculation," said Lena Ward, the human economic attaché who had arrived overnight from the nearest relay station, because Earth Command had decided I should not be the only human in the room anymore. Lena was 34, efficient, and had the particular quality of sounding genuinely curious about things she already knew the answer to. "The calculation is clear," Sarath said. "It is clear," Lena agreed pleasantly. "I am curious about the underlying variable. The fleet engagement model assumes static positioning for human assets. Are you using the transit speed figure from our council membership filing or the updated figure?" A pause. "The figure in your membership filing," said one of Sarath's block members. "That figure is 60 years old," Lena said. "We have faster ships now. I can send the updated specifications if that would help the model." Another pause. Longer. I looked at my coffee. The thing about Sarath's calculation, the thing that her 16 analysts and her intelligence division had gotten exactly wrong in the same way, was that they were counting ships. They were looking at 512,000 dreadnoughts as a number, as a count, as a pile to be weighed against another pile, and they were doing the arithmetic on that basis. Humanity does not think in piles. My grandfather ran a machine repair business in rural Ohio. He fixed things, tractors, generators, the kind of heavy equipment that other people needed to work their land. He used to say that the difference between a tool and a weapon was only what you pointed it at. He said this while fixing a tractor. He meant the tractor. 500,000 dreadnoughts, in the way Sarath was thinking about them, were a weapon aimed at someone. A threat. A loaded thing waiting to fire. In the way I had grown up understanding them, the way every human who lived through the generation after 2089 understood them, they were something else entirely. They were the answer to a question that no one in this room had been alive to hear asked. I did not say this. Not yet. The block member who had cited the old transit speed figure was quietly consulting with someone off-screen. His expression had the quality of a calculation being hurriedly revised. Sarath had not moved. She was watching Lena with the specific attention of someone who has identified a variable they missed. "I withdraw nothing from my proposal," Sarath said. "The core concern stands regardless of ship speed." "Of course," Lena said. "I only want the model to be accurate." Varen, from his seat in the Keth block, said nothing. He was looking at the main display, where the numbers still sat. His hands were folded the same way they had been the day before, and the day before that. During the recess, he found me in the corridor again. "The observation window, the stars. She is not wrong that you could destroy us," he said. "No," I said. "She is wrong about why you built what you built." I looked at him. "We have fought 6 wars," he said. "In 300 years, we won 4, we lost 2. He paused. "After the first loss, we built more ships. After the second, we built more than that. Not because we wanted to fight again." He was quiet for a moment. "Because the thing that defeats you in a war is never the war itself. It is the moment, before the war, when you were small enough that something decided you were worth attacking." I said nothing. "You built 500,000 ships," he said, "because something, once, decided you were worth attacking when you were small." Outside, the stars. Yes, I said. He nodded. Slow, the way Keth veterans nodded, like they were filing the information somewhere permanent. Then I know what 2089 was, he said. I do not need to read the file. We went back inside. The recess ended. Sarath's motion came to a formal vote. It failed, by 1 vote. Varen abstained. On his way past my chair, he did not look at me. He sat down, folded his hands, and looked at the floor in front of him, the way he always did. I looked at the floor in front of me. On the display above Cetherix's station, the number was still there. 512,941 Dreadnought-class vessels, plus support fleets. Patient. Unhurried. It had nowhere to be. The formal inquiry into 2089 was called for the following morning. The Council named it, in their official filing language, a historical context review, which was the diplomatic equivalent of calling a fire a heat event. It meant the same thing, and the naming made nobody feel better, and everybody slightly more comfortable with the procedure. I had been born in 2091. I want to be clear about that, because people sometimes look at me, knowing my age, knowing the year I was born, and they do a calculation that produces a conclusion I need to correct. Being born 2 years after 2089 does not mean I missed it. It means I arrived into the aftermath of it, which is its own kind of education. I grew up in houses where certain rooms had extra reinforcement. I went to schools where the evacuation drills were not theoretical. I had a grandmother who kept a photograph on her kitchen wall, and the photograph was of Earth, taken from orbit, and it was not the restored image they use in official communications. It was the original, the one taken during. She never explained it. She never took it down. Some things do not need an explanation, and cannot be replaced by one. My name is Voss Terran, and I was not there, and it has been with me every day of my life anyway. The inquiry chamber was configured differently than the previous sessions. Smaller audience. The ceremonial guards had been rotated out for staff personnel, which meant the council was treating this as a working session rather than theater. Queelith was present. Sarath was present but seated 1 row back, which was either a coincidence or a signal, and nothing Sarath did was a coincidence. Varen was present, same seat, same folded hands. Lena sat beside me. She had a tablet. She had not slept. The council's lead historian, a Valorian named Orvith who was old enough that his membrane had gone translucent at the edges, stood to present the contextual framework. He explained that the inquiry was seeking to understand the historical events of Earth year 2089, also recorded in Council archives under the designation First Contact Incident, Type Omega, a classification that had not been applied before or since. He then said, with the care of someone who had chosen every word at least 4 times, that the Council's existing records on this incident were limited, fragmentary, and drawn primarily from the monitoring data of a long-range observation platform that had been 12 light hours from the event zone. What that meant, translated out of academic language, was that the Council had known something happened in 2089. They had watched it from a distance, with instruments pointed at a minor single-system species they had categorized as pre-contact, and they had recorded what their instruments could capture, and they had filed it, and then they had moved on, because in a galaxy the size of this one, things happen all the time, and not all of them require follow-up. They had not followed up on 2089. I thought about my grandmother's photograph. Orvith concluded his introduction and invited the human delegation to present the historical record. Lena pressed play. The archive ran for 43 minutes. It was not a dramatic presentation. It was the kind of footage that documentation produces, when the events themselves are dramatic enough that any production choice would be an insult. Raw sensor feeds, communication intercepts, damage assessments, casualty figures presented in clean rows without comment, because comment would not have added anything, and the people who compiled the archive knew that. What came to human space in 2089 had not announced itself. That is the part that people outside the experience find difficult to understand. There was no declaration. There was no ultimatum. There was no transmission on any frequency that human instruments could detect at the time, though later analysis suggested there had been communications, just not ones directed at us. They had not communicated with us because, by their assessment, there was nothing to communicate. You do not negotiate with a rock in your path. You move it. They came for 2 worlds, Earth and the colony on Mars that had been established 14 years prior, 40,000 people, a settlement that still had temporary structures mixed in with the permanent ones, because the permanent ones were still being built. What happened next was 19 months. I am not going to describe 19 months in detail. The archive did that, and the archive was enough. What I will say is this. At the end of 19 months, there were no more of them. Not in our system. Not anywhere we could subsequently find. What we had lost was a number I had known since childhood, the way you know your own address and your grandmother's name, the kind of knowledge that goes in early and never comes out. The archive ended. The room was silent. Orvith said nothing. He had seen the file. He sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at them. Sarath had not moved in 11 minutes. I had been watching. Quelith's hand was at her collar again, the gold-threaded one. She had touched it 17 times in 43 minutes. I had stopped watching the archive about 8 minutes in, once I had confirmed it was running correctly, and I had watched the room instead, because the room was where the important things were happening. After the archive ended, I had expected questions. The council panel had submitted 42 questions in advance, which Orvith had distributed, which Lena and I had spent the previous night preparing answers for. Nobody asked their questions. Quelith broke the silence. "Did anything survive?" she said. "The force that came, did any of them survive?" The question was quiet, not political, not procedural. "No," I said. One word. Quelith looked at me for a long time. Then she looked at the blank display where the archive had been running. Then she put her hand flat on the table, the way Orvith had. Sarath, one row back, straightened the material of her robe. Once, twice. She did not speak. Varen, in his usual seat, unfolded his hands for the first time in 3 days. He looked at his palms. Then he folded them again. The session was adjourned without a formal conclusion being filed. Orvith would write one later, carefully, in the language that official documents use, and it would say things that were accurate and would not capture anything that was true. I walked out of the chamber, down the corridor, to the promenade, which was the part of the station that the architects had built as though they were trying to apologize for what deep space actually was. There was a garden, real plants, engineered for the light spectrum the station's lamps produced, green and slightly too perfect, the way things are when nature has been optimized. There were benches. There was a fountain that recycled the same water in a loop and produced a sound that was meant to be calming. I sat on a bench. I thought about my grandmother's photograph. I thought about my grandfather, who never talked about his service but kept his military identification on his keychain until the day he died. A small worn piece of metal with numbers on it that he touched without seeming to notice he was doing it. I thought about Earth, 400 years of being a shipyard and then not being one, the decision made by people who were rebuilding from 19 months of loss, and looked at their children and decided, not here, build it somewhere else. Build it somewhere the children do not have to see it. Let them grow up in something that does not look like a fortress. The garden around me was very quiet. I did not notice Varen until he sat down on the bench beside me. He was quiet in a way that was almost rude, given the amount of physical space he occupied. We sat in the garden for a while. "The word I used," he said, eventually, 2 days ago, at the window. "I know what it means," I said. "Then you know I do not use it easily." "I know." He looked at the fountain, the water going around and around. "My species has a tradition," he said. "When we encounter a force that has destroyed something we could not destroy, we do not count their weapons. We count their dead. Because the weapons tell you what they are capable of, but the dead tell you what they are willing to endure." I did not answer. "I counted your dead," he said. The fountain recycled. The water went around. "Varen," I said. "Commander, thank you, for the vote." He was quiet for a moment. I abstained. "I know what an abstention costs in your culture," I said. Another pause, longer. "Yes," he said. "I suppose you do." He stood. He was very large standing up. He looked down at me with the expression he used for everything, the one that did not change on the surface but moved underneath. "Tomorrow's session," he said. "I know," I said. He went back inside. I sat in the garden a while longer. The plants were too green and too perfect. and the fountain kept recycling the same water, and it was the most peaceful I had felt in 4 days. I pulled out my personal communicator and held it for a moment. Then I sent a message to my mother. 2 words. I'm okay. She would not get it for 6 hours. She would know what I meant. She always did. The final session opened on the 4th morning. I was there early. Not because I needed to be, because I had discovered, in 4 days of carrying something heavy through rooms full of people who had not known they were about to feel its weight, that arriving early was the only reliable way I had of finding 2 minutes of quiet before the noise started again. The chamber was full. Every seat, every delegation. The ceremonial guards were back, which meant Quelith had made the session official, which meant she had already decided something and was ready to record it. Lena sat beside me. She had slept 3 hours, she said. She had also filed 12 supplementary briefings overnight and eaten a meal that was not from the synth station, which for Lena constituted a significant personal achievement. At the front of the chamber, Setherix had removed the census display from the main screen. In its place was a blank council seal, the official symbol used when a session was opening without a preset agenda item, which meant whatever happened today had not been decided yet. I had the text of humanity's formal response in my jacket pocket. Folded. Physical paper, which I had requested from the station's supply office, which had required explaining to a very confused administrative drone that yes, humans still used paper sometimes, and yes, it had to be real paper, and no, a digital reproduction of paper was not the same thing. The request had taken 40 minutes to fulfill. The drone had managed it, visibly baffled, and I had thanked it, and the thank you had also confused it. Quelith opened the session. She was precise and formal, and the expression she was wearing was the one I had seen her build over 4 days, the one where the thing she was feeling had been moved to a location in herself, where it would not interfere with her function, where it would sit and be dealt with later, privately, in whatever way Valorians dealt with things they had not expected to feel. The Council has reviewed the submitted materials, she said, the historical record, the fleet census data, and the analytical reports commissioned for this purpose. We have 3 formal proposals to consider, each submitted by member delegations. I already knew what they were. Lena had obtained the text of all 3 the previous evening. The first was Sereth's revised motion, softened from Class Omega threat to strategic monitoring status, which in practical terms meant the Council would establish a permanent observation committee with oversight of human expansion activity. It had 12 signatures, down from 16. 4 delegations had quietly withdrawn overnight. The second was a proposal from the Doran Collective for a negotiated fleet reduction agreement, asking humanity to voluntarily decommission 300,000 ships to bring human military capacity to a level the Council's models called proportionate. The third was a joint filing from 7 smaller species, submitted by their collective representative, a nervous Yeth named Ulis, who had spent 3 days making himself as invisible as possible and had clearly lost sleep about the proposal he was now required to present publicly. It asked, in the careful language of small species in a room with large ones, whether the Council might consider opening a formal discussion about mutual protection frameworks. Quelith presented all 3. She did not indicate preference. That was her skill. The room could not read her, and the room was always reading her. The human delegation has indicated a wish to respond, she said. Commander Terran. I stood. I took the paper out of my pocket, unfolded it, smoothed it once, not because it needed smoothing, but because the motion of smoothing paper is something my hands knew, and my hands needed something familiar. I am not going to deliver a speech, I said. I have one. Here, prepared and reviewed by Earth Command and the Diplomatic Office, and 3 legal teams. I am going to set it aside. Quelith's expression moved, slightly. What I am going to do instead is tell you what Earth Command asked me to communicate in plain terms, without the language that makes things sound like policies instead of decisions. I looked at the room. 14 delegations, the Keth block, the Miran section, where Sarath sat with her hands flat and her robes still, the Thurvians, who had spent 4 days being very quiet and thoughtful, in the way of people who had just discovered that the mild-mannered neighbor they had never thought much about had a very large basement, the Doran, the Yeth, and nervous Ulis, who was watching me with the specific attention of someone hoping for something they were not sure they were allowed to hope for. And Varen, folded hands, eyes up, now, rather than at the floor, watching. Humanity is prepared to extend full defensive treaty rights to every species in this council, I said. Mutual protection. Any threat to any member species is a threat that humanity responds to. Unconditional. No tiered membership. No political conditionality. You are in, or you are not in, and if you are in, then what we have is yours when you need it. I let that sit. In exchange, I said, humanity asks for nothing. The silence that followed was not the silence of the census reveal, which had been the silence of shock, a sudden stop, a collective intake. This silence was different. It was the silence of a room trying to locate the hidden condition, the catch, the debt structure underneath the offer, because in the council's entire recorded history, nothing had ever been offered without a ledger attached. Quelith spoke first. Nothing. Nothing, I said. That is not a framework we have precedent for, she said. I know, I said. There must be terms. There are no terms, I said. An offer with terms is a transaction. This is not a transaction. Sarath, from her seat one row back, said quietly, Then what is it? I looked at her. She had asked the right question, maybe the only question that mattered. The Keth representative asked me something. 2 days ago, I said. He asked why, not how. Why 500,000 ships? He had the right instinct. The how is logistics. The why is the only thing that matters. I looked at the paper in my hands. I was not reading from it. I just wanted something to hold. In 2089, something came for us when we had 2 worlds. 40,000 colonists on one of them still living in temporary structures, and no allies in a galaxy that did not know our name. We were alone. Completely alone, and we nearly ended. The room was very quiet. We did not build 500,000 ships because we want a war, I said. We have had a war. We know what one costs. We know it in a way that I cannot put a number on because the number is not the point. The number is just where the understanding lives. My voice was level. I had practiced being level about this since I was old enough to understand what level meant. We built those ships because we made a promise. Not to any government. Not to any council, to ourselves, that we would never again be the species that something looked at and decided was too small to matter. That we would never again be alone in the dark when something came. Varen was looking at me, full attention, no expression, the kind of focus that only happens when someone has already understood what you are saying and is listening for the thing underneath. And we would like, I said, for nobody else to be alone in the dark when something comes. If we can help that. If you will let us help that, that is the offer. I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted. Then Varen stood up. It is worth explaining what that means, in Keth diplomatic tradition, because without context it looks like a man standing from a chair, which is not what it was. In the Keth Dominion, standing in a council session is the equivalent of a permanent unilateral declaration of alliance. It is not a vote. It is not a proposal. It requires no second, no ratification, no procedural follow-up. It is a declaration, made in the body, that the Keth Dominion considers itself in permanent alliance with the entity being addressed, without condition and without expiration. It cannot be undone. In 300 years of Keth diplomatic presence in the Galactic Council, it had been done 4 times. Varen stood. He did not look at the panel. He did not look at Sarath or Quelith or Cetherix or Ulis or any of the 14 delegations sitting in that room. He looked at me. I had prepared for this moment. I had prepared for the treaty discussion and the counter-proposals and the procedural motions and the negotiating language and the follow-up sessions and the 3 legal teams. I had prepared for everything that might happen in a chamber full of alien diplomats on the 4th morning of the most consequential political summit humanity had ever been party to. I had not prepared for an old Keth warrior to stand up and look at me like that. I looked at the ceiling. The station's lighting was warm morning gold, the optimistic architect's choice. I looked at it for a moment. Dust, probably. The station had a garden. All those plants. It got everywhere. I brought my eyes back down. Varen was still standing, still looking at me. I nodded at him. He sat. The chamber began to move. Ulis, the nervous Yeth, was whispering rapidly to his delegation. The Thurvians were conferring in low tones, but not the tones of alarm, the tones of people revising a position. Quilith had both hands flat on the table and was looking at the space in front of her. Sarath, one row back, was very still. I did not watch her. I had enough to watch. Lena pressed her knee briefly against mine under the table. It lasted 1 second. She was already looking at her tablet. It meant, good. The vote on the Mutual Protection Framework opened 2 hours later. The session ran 4 hours past its scheduled close. There were amendments. There were procedural objections. There were 3 recesses and 1 moment when Cetherix's data terminal crashed and had to be restarted. And the 5 minutes of loading time was the quietest 5 minutes the station had experienced in 4 days. At the end of it, 14 signatures. Unanimous. The first unanimous resolution in 60 years of Galactic Council records. I sent Earth Command 3 words. Room is held. They sent back 2. We know. Outside the observation window, the stars were in exactly the same positions they had been on the first morning when I arrived early, with my cold coffee, and my data tablet, and the knowledge of what number was about to appear on Cetherix's display. Patient, unhurried, not particularly interested in the decisions of the small warm things that moved between them. I stood at the window for a while. I thought about the photograph on my grandmother's wall. Earth from orbit, the original, the one taken during. She never took it down, and she never explained it, and I understood now, in the way you understand things, that you have known for a long time, and finally have a place to put, that it was not a reminder. It was not a monument to suffering, or a record of loss, or an act of grief she could not release. It was a promise she kept, where she could see it every day. We were not building toward war. We were building toward the moment when a room full of frightened strangers could look at what we had built and understand that it was not pointed at them. We were building toward the moment when someone stood up. 500,000 dreadnoughts, worth every one.